What happens when humanity's greatest failure becomes its most terrifying success? 15 years ago, the exploration vessel Prometheus vanished into the void during mankind's first attempt at faster-than-light travel. The catastrophic failure of the experimental jump drive didn't just destroy a ship, it shattered humanity's dreams of joining the galactic community as equals. While alien civilizations had mastered FTL centuries ago, humans remained trapped in their solar system, marking them as a primitive species barely worth acknowledgement. But, today, long-range sensors detected something impossible: the Prometheus has returned. The ship that limped back to Earth's orbit wasn't the same vessel that had departed with such hope. Its hull bore scars from unknown energies, its design had been fundamentally altered with technology that defied every known law of physics, and, most disturbing of all, the crew was still alive, unchanged by 15 years that should have aged them beyond recognition. What the crew of the Prometheus brought back would either elevate humanity to heights beyond imagination or reveal that some doors in the universe should never be opened. Because the technology they carried didn't just bend the rules of reality, it rewrote them entirely. The aliens who had dismissed humanity as a backwater species were about to discover that sometimes, the greatest innovations come from those desperate enough to break every rule in existence. This is the story of how humanity's greatest disaster became the catalyst for an evolution that would reshape the galaxy itself. Admiral Sarah Chen stood before the massive observation deck of Luna Station, her weathered hands pressed against the reinforced transparent aluminum as she stared at the impossible sight hanging in Earth's orbit. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she hadn't moved since the initial detection alert had screamed across every communication channel in the Sol system. The ship floating in the darkness beyond Earth's atmosphere was unmistakably the Prometheus, yet everything about it was wrong. The sleek lines of humanity's first faster-than-light exploration vessel had been transformed into something that hurt to look at directly. The hull rippled with an oily, iridescent sheen that seemed to shift between dimensions, while geometric patterns that followed no earthly mathematics covered its surface like living tattoos. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission," reported Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos, her voice tight with barely controlled tension. "It's definitely coming from the Prometheus, but the signal is strange. It's broadcasting on frequencies that theoretically shouldn't exist." Chen turned from the viewport, her gray eyes reflecting years of commanding humanity's defense forces during the dark period following the Prometheus disaster. 15 years of alien species treating Earth like a quarantined backwater, 15 years of being denied access to the galactic community because humanity couldn't master the basic technology required for interstellar travel. The failure of the Prometheus had branded their entire species as technological primitives. "Put it through," Chun ordered, settling into her command chair. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the subtle vibration of the station's rotation. The speakers crackled to life, but the voice that emerged was hauntingly familiar despite the years that had passed. "Luna Station, this is Captain Michael Harrison of the Earth vessel Prometheus. Requesting immediate permission to dock. We have significant developments to report." Chen's breath caught in her throat. She had known Michael Harrison personally, had recommended him for the mission that was supposed to establish humanity as a legitimate player in galactic politics. His voice sounded exactly as it had 15 years ago, no aging, nowhere from what should have been an impossible journey through space and time. "Captain Harrison," Chen responded, her voice carefully controlled despite the chaos of emotions roiling within her. "This is Admiral Chen. We need verification of your identity and an explanation for your 15-year absence. Our sensors are detecting technology aboard your vessel that doesn't match any known human or alien specifications." There was a pause, filled with the kind of static that seemed to whisper secrets just beyond the edge of comprehension. When Harrison's voice returned, it carried an undertone that made several bridge officers unconsciously step back from their consoles. "Admiral, we understand your caution. We've been elsewhere. The jump drive failure didn't destroy us as believed. It opened something that shouldn't have been opened. We've learned things about the universe that will change everything. But we need to dock immediately. There are parties who would prefer that humanity remains ignorant of what we've discovered." Chen felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of parties, Captain?" "The same ones who ensured our jump drive failed in the first place." The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. Chen's mind raced through the implications. The Prometheus mission had been humanity's greatest technological achievement, combining decades of research with alien technological principles purchased at enormous cost from the Hegemony Trade Council. If the failure had been sabotage rather than human incompetence. Santos, get me a priority channel to Earth Defense Command, Chun ordered. And, prepare Docking Bay 7 for an unknown technological quarantine. I want every sensor we have trained on that ship, and I want our best Xenotech specialists standing by. As the orders were carried out with practiced efficiency, Chen found herself studying the transformed vessel through the observation port once more. The patterns on its hull seemed to pulse in rhythm with something that might have been a heartbeat, and she could swear she saw glimpses of spaces within the ship that were larger than the ship itself. The docking procedure took 3 hours, during which every instrument on Luna Station registered readings that their designers had insisted were impossible. Gravitational fields fluctuated in ways that violated Einstein's theories, electromagnetic readings suggested the ship was somehow existing in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, and the temperature scanners couldn't decide if the Prometheus was generating heat or absorbing it from the surrounding space. Captain Harrison emerged from the airlock looking exactly as he had 15 years earlier, a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and intelligent blue eyes that had always seemed to see more than they should. But those eyes now held depths that made Chen uncomfortable, as if they had seen things that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human experience. Admiral Chen, Harrison said, extending a hand that felt perfectly normal despite everything else about the situation. Thank you for allowing us to dock. I know this must be difficult to process. That's an understatement, Captain, Chen replied. Your crew? All present and accounted for. All unchanged by our journey, though we've learned things that will take time to explain. We need to speak privately, and we need to do it quickly. The Hegemony will detect our return soon, and, when they do, they'll move to suppress what we've brought back. Chen led Harrison to her private office, a Spartan space that reflected her military background and current responsibilities. As soon as the door sealed behind them, Harrison's demeanor changed subtly, as if a mask had slipped away to reveal something both more and less human than what had been there before. Sarah, Harrison said, using her first name for the first time since his return. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully. The universe is not what we've been told. Faster than light travel, the technology that every advanced species in the galaxy uses, comes with a price that none of them talk about. It requires tapping into something that exists outside normal spacetime, something that's been waiting for conscious minds to open doors it cannot open itself. Chen sat down heavily in her chair, feeling the weight of implications she didn't yet fully understand. Go on. The jump drive failure wasn't a failure. It was sabotage by hegemony agents who knew that human creativity and technological intuition posed a threat to the established order. But they didn't account for human stubbornness. When our drive core destabilized, instead of being destroyed, we were pulled into the space between dimensions, a realm where the rules of physics are more like suggestions, and where intelligence from outside our reality has been waiting for someone clever enough to make contact. Harrison moved to the viewport, staring out at Earth's blue-white marble suspended in the darkness. We spent 15 years learning from entities that exist beyond the concept of matter and energy. They taught us things about the universe that the hegemony has been deliberately keeping secret. Technologies that don't just allow faster than light travel, but make it as simple as stepping from one room to another. Ways of manipulating matter and energy that make current understanding look like cave paintings. And the price? Chen asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. The price is evolution, Sarah. Humanity has to become something more than what we are. Not physically, we remain human, but intellectually and spiritually. We have to accept that consciousness itself is a force that can reshape reality, and that human consciousness has properties that make us uniquely suited to technologies that other species fear to touch. Harrison turned back to face her, and, for a moment, Chen saw something in his eyes that seemed to extend into dimensions she couldn't name. The beings we encountered showed us the truth about galactic civilization. Every species that achieves FTL travel using conventional methods becomes locked into a specific pattern of technological development. They become stable, predictable, and, ultimately stagnant. The hegemony maintains this system because it ensures their continued dominance. But, human consciousness is different. We dream in ways that other species cannot, we imagine possibilities that they dismiss as impossible, and we have an inherent tendency to break rules just to see what happens. That's why they sabotaged our first attempt, not because we might fail, but because we might succeed too well. Chen stood and moved to join Harrison at the viewport. What did you bring back? Everything, Harrison said simply. Complete schematics for technology that will make humanity the most advanced species in the galaxy overnight. Energy systems that draw power directly from quantum fluctuations, manufacturing techniques that can assemble matter at the atomic level, and, yes, faster-than-light systems that don't require tapping into external dimensional entities because they use human consciousness as the navigational matrix. But, more than that, we brought back proof of what the hegemony has been hiding. Evidence of older civilizations that were systematically eliminated because they developed technologies that threatened the established order. Records of species that achieved transcendence and were destroyed to prevent others from following their path. Chen felt a mix of excitement and terror as the implications sank in. How long do we have before the hegemony responds? Hours, maybe days. They'll detect the dimensional disturbance caused by our return, and they'll know that we've accessed forbidden knowledge. They'll come with overwhelming force, intending to sterilize Earth rather than risk the spread of what we've learned. Then, we need to move fast, Chen said, her mind already shifting into crisis management mode. How quickly can your technologies be implemented? Harrison smiled, and, for the first time since his return, it was a purely human expression. That's the beautiful thing about consciousness-based technology, Sarah. Implementation is limited only by understanding and will. We don't need to build the tools, we need to become them. As if to demonstrate his point, Harrison gestured toward the viewport. The space around the Prometheus began to shimmer, and, suddenly, the ship's hull became transparent, revealing an interior that defied every law of spatial geometry. Corridors stretched into impossible distances, chambers contained what looked like miniature stars, and, at the ship's heart, something that might have been a machine or might have been alive pulsed with rhythms that seemed to echo from beyond the visible universe. The first lesson, Harrison said, is that reality is far more malleable than we've been led to believe. The second lesson is that humans have an inherent ability to reshape reality through focused intention and technological augmentation. The third lesson is that we're about to find out if our species is ready to claim its true place in the universe. Chen stared at the impossible ship floating beyond the viewport and realized that everything she had believed about humanity's limitations was about to change. The question was whether they would survive long enough to see what they could become. Captain, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating, I think it's time to wake up our sleeping giant. If the hegemony wants a fight, they're about to discover what happens when you corner the most stubborn, creative, and dangerously innovative species in the galaxy. Harrison's smile widened, and Chen saw in his eyes the reflection of possibilities that stretched beyond the stars themselves. The Prometheus had returned not as a failed exploration vessel, but as the herald of humanity's true awakening. The universe was about to learn why the phrase "never tell a human something is impossible" was about to become more than just a saying, it was about to become the foundation of a new cosmic order. The emergency session of the United Earth Council convened in the deepest levels of Geneva Command, far beneath the Swiss mountains where even the most sophisticated alien surveillance technology couldn't penetrate. Admiral Chen stood before the assembled representatives of humanity's various nations and colonies, her uniform crisp despite having had no sleep in the past 36 hours. The holographic display floating above the conference table showed a three-dimensional representation of the Prometheus, but the technical specifications scrolling alongside it made several council members visibly uncomfortable. Energy readings that exceeded the output of entire star systems, material compositions that included elements that shouldn't exist, and dimensional coordinates that pointed to locations outside of known spacetime. President Elizabeth Warren of the North American Federation leaned forward, her expression grim. Admiral, are you telling us that this ship has been traveling through what amounts to an alternate reality for 15 years? That's the simplified explanation, Madam President, Chen replied. Captain Harrison and his crew have provided us with detailed records of their experiences. They encountered entities that exist outside our normal dimensional framework, beings of pure consciousness that have been observing our universe since before matter itself formed. Chancellor Klaus Richter of the European Union shook his head. This sounds like science fiction, Admiral. How can we verify any of these claims? Before Chen could respond, the lights in the conference room flickered, and the air itself seemed to shimmer. Captain Harrison materialized in the center of the room, not through any doorway or transport technology, but simply appearing as if he had always been there. Several security guards reached for their weapons before stopping in confusion, their hands passing through empty air where their sidearms should have been. "Forgive the dramatic entrance," Harrison said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "But demonstration is more convincing than explanation. Your weapons, gentlemen, are safely stored in a pocket dimension. They'll return when I stop focusing on their relocation." The guards' weapons rematerialized in their holsters as if they had never left. Prime Minister Yuki Tanaka of the Pacific Alliance spoke first, her voice carefully controlled. "Captain Harrison, what exactly are you?" "I'm still human, Prime Minister," Harrison replied, though his form seemed slightly translucent around the edges. "But I'm a human who has learned to interface directly with the quantum substrate of reality. What the entities in dimensional space taught us is that consciousness isn't merely an emergent property of complex neural networks, it's a fundamental force of the universe, as basic as gravity or electromagnetism." Dr. Amara Okafor, Director of Human Scientific Development, leaned forward intently. "Are you saying that consciousness can directly manipulate physical reality?" "I'm saying that consciousness creates physical reality," Harrison corrected. "What we perceive as solid matter, energy, and the forces that govern them are all manifestations of information patterns in a deeper level of existence. Most species never discover this because their consciousness operates within narrow parameters established by their evolutionary history." Harrison gestured, and the air above the conference table filled with shifting geometric patterns that seemed to extend into dimensions the human eye couldn't quite follow. "But human consciousness is different. We dream in ways that reshape probability, we imagine scenarios that alter quantum outcomes, and we have an inherent tendency to question the fundamental assumptions that other species accept without examination. The patterns in the air solidified into a perfect replica of Earth, complete down to weather patterns and city lights. This is why the hegemony fears us. Their entire civilization is built on the premise that reality has fixed rules that cannot be changed. They've created technologies that work within those rules, established social structures that depend on predictable limitations, and built an economy based on scarcity of resources that we now know are infinitely abundant." Secretary General Kofi Asante of the African Union stood up slowly. "Captain, what exactly are you proposing we do with this knowledge?" "We're going to completely rewrite the rules of galactic civilization," Harrison said with a smile that contained light from distant stars. "But first, we need to survive the immediate response. Our return has already been detected. Hegemony fleets are mobilizing from 3 different sectors, and they're not coming to negotiate." Admiral Chan activated her tactical display, showing long-range sensor readings from monitoring stations throughout the solar system. "Our deep space arrays detected the first signatures 6 hours ago. Based on current approach vectors, we estimate contact in approximately 18 hours. "What kind of forces are we looking at?" asked President Warren. "Conventional analysis suggests we're facing overwhelming odds," Chen replied grimly. 3 full battle fleets comprising approximately 400 vessels, including Dreadnought-class ships that individually outgun our entire defensive network. If they intended to negotiate, they would have sent diplomatic vessels. These are extermination fleets." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound, Captain Harrison laughing. "Forgive me," he said, noting the shocked expressions around the table. "But you're still thinking in terms of conventional warfare. What we're about to demonstrate is why conventional analysis becomes irrelevant when consciousness-based technology enters the equation." Harrison moved to the holographic display of Earth and placed his hand directly into the projection. Instead of passing through the light construct, his hand interacted with it as if it were solid matter. The image of Earth began to change, showing technological structures that hadn't existed moments before. Over the past 36 hours, while Admiral Chan and I have been briefing leadership, the crew of the Prometheus has been busy. Using consciousness-directed fabrication techniques, we've established a network of quantum resonance nodes throughout the solar system. Each node is simultaneously a manufacturing facility, energy collection system, and dimensional anchor point. The display zoomed out to show the entire solar system, now dotted with installations that seem to pulse with their own inner light. These nodes are powered by direct consciousness interface with zero-point energy fields. They can manufacture any technology we can conceptualize, modify matter at the subatomic level, and create defensive systems that operate outside the normal parameters of spacetime. Defense Minister Sarah Kozlov of the Russian Federation studied the display with professional interest. Captain, are you telling us that you've essentially industrialized the entire solar system in less than 2 days? The beautiful thing about consciousness-based manufacturing, Harrison explained, is that production time is limited only by the clarity of intention and the complexity of the design. When humans dream of something with sufficient focus and detail, the universe tends to make it real. We've simply learned to do it consciously and with technological amplification. Dr. Okafor was frantically taking notes. This challenges every assumption we have about resource limitation, manufacturing capability, and technological development timelines. If consciousness can directly manipulate matter and energy, then scarcity becomes a choice rather than a limitation, Harrison finished. Which is exactly why the hegemony has spent millions of years ensuring that species never discover this capability. Their entire power structure depends on controlling access to resources and technology that we can now produce at will. President Warren stood up, her expression reflecting the magnitude of the decision she was about to make. Captain Harrison, Admiral Chen, what do you need from us to implement whatever defense you're planning? Actually, Harrison said, his form beginning to shift back toward full opacity, we need the opposite of what you might expect. We need humanity to do what it does best, dream impossible dreams and refuse to accept that anything is truly impossible. The nodes we've established throughout the system are connected to human consciousness through quantum resonance. The more people who understand and accept what we're capable of becoming, the more powerful our defensive capabilities become. Admiral Chan activated a global communication system that would broadcast to every human settlement from Luna City to the mining colonies in the asteroid belt. This is Admiral Sarah Chen of United Earth Command. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need every human being in the Sol system to listen carefully and understand that our survival depends on your ability to believe in possibilities that extend beyond everything we thought we knew about reality. As Chen began to explain the situation to humanity as a whole, Harrison turned to the assembled leaders. There's something else you need to understand. The hegemony fleets approaching our system aren't just coming to destroy human civilization. They're coming to prevent the spread of consciousness-based technology throughout the galaxy. If we succeed in demonstrating that their fundamental assumptions about reality are false, every species under their control will begin to question the limitations that have been imposed on them. Chancellor Richter frowned. Are you saying this conflict is about more than just Earth? This conflict is about the future of consciousness itself in this galaxy, Harrison replied. For millions of years, the hegemony has maintained control by convincing species that they are limited by the physical laws of the universe. They've created a civilization based on artificial scarcity, technological stagnation, and acceptance of predetermined roles in a cosmic hierarchy. Harrison gestured toward the display showing the approaching alien fleets. But consciousness is not bound by the limitations that govern matter and energy. Human consciousness, in particular, has properties that make us uniquely suited to technologies that can reshape reality itself. If we survive the next 24 hours and demonstrate what we've learned, we'll trigger a revolution that will spread to every intelligent species in the galaxy. The implications were staggering. Secretary General Asante spoke for everyone in the room when he asked, Captain, are you telling us that Earth has become the focal point for a galactic war between freedom and oppression? I'm telling you that humanity has always been the catalyst for change, Harrison replied. We've just never had the tools to change things on a cosmic scale before. The entities we encountered in dimensional space have been waiting millions of years for a species with the right combination of creativity, stubbornness, and willingness to break fundamental rules just to see what happens. Admiral Chen finished her global broadcast and turned back to the council. Ladies and gentlemen, across the solar system, humans are now consciously focusing their intention on expanding our defensive capabilities. The quantum resonance nodes are responding to collective human will, and the results are unprecedented. The holographic display updated to show the solar system as it now existed. The simple network of nodes had transformed into something that resembled a vast neural network, with connections spanning from Mercury to the outer planets. Energy patterns flowed between the nodes in configurations that seemed to follow the logic of thought rather than physics. The human imagination, Harrison said with satisfaction, is about to meet alien technology that was designed to suppress imagination. This should be interesting. Prime Minister Tanaka studied the display with the eye of someone who had spent her career managing impossible situations. Captain, assuming we survive this encounter, what happens next? How does humanity integrate consciousness-based technology into our civilization without losing what makes us human? Harrison's expression became thoughtful. That's perhaps the most important question you could ask, Prime Minister. The entities we encountered emphasized that consciousness-based technology amplifies what already exists within a species. If we're creative and compassionate, the technology makes us more creative and compassionate. If we're aggressive and destructive, it amplifies those traits as well. The key is maintaining our essential humanity while expanding our capabilities. We remain recognizably human, but we become humans who can reshape reality through focused intention. We keep our emotions, our relationships, our capacity for growth and change. We simply add the ability to make our dreams real. Dr. Okafor looked up from her notes. Are there safeguards? Ways to prevent the technology from being misused? The technology itself is the safeguard, Harrison explained. Consciousness-based systems respond to the user's true intentions, not their stated goals. Someone who seeks to use these capabilities for genuine benefit will find them nearly unlimited. Someone who seeks to use them for selfish or destructive purposes will find them increasingly difficult to access. It's as if the universe itself has a preference for consciousness that creates rather than destroys, that builds connections rather than divisions. Which makes sense when you consider that consciousness may be the mechanism through which the universe understands itself. The strategic implications were becoming clear to Admiral Chen. So our best defense against the hegemony fleets isn't just our new technology, it's the fact that their entire approach to warfare assumes limitations that no longer apply to us. Exactly, Harrison confirmed. They're bringing conventional weapons to fight an enemy that has learned to rewrite the rules of engagement. They're planning to destroy ships and installations that can be reconstructed through conscious intention. They're trying to impose limitations on a species that has just learned to transcend limitation itself. As if summoned by their conversation, alerts began sounding throughout the command center. The hegemony fleets had arrived at the edge of the solar system, and they were broadcasting demands for Earth's immediate surrender. Harrison smiled, and, for a moment, his form flickered between human appearance and something that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Time to show the galaxy what happens when you try to suppress the dreams of humanity. They wanted us to remain primitive and limited. Instead, they've given us a reason to become something that will reshape the cosmic order itself. The war for the future of consciousness was about to begin. Admiral Chen watched from Luna Station's command center as the hegemony fleets arranged themselves in perfect geometric formations at the edge of the solar system. The alien vessels were beautiful in their precision, sleek dreadnoughts that had conquered 1,000 worlds, destroyer wings that moved like schools of mechanical fish, and, at the center of each fleet, massive command ships that had never known defeat in 10,000 years of galactic warfare. The lead vessel, a kilometer-long behemoth bearing the insignia of the Zetharian Empire, opened a communication channel. The voice that emerged spoke perfect English, though it carried harmonics that suggested a very non-human vocal structure. Primitive species of the third planet, the voice declared with the casual authority of absolute power, you possess technology that violates fundamental laws established for the safety and stability of galactic civilization. You will surrender this technology immediately, submit to hegemony oversight, and accept relocation to designated preservation zones where your development can be properly managed. Admiral Chen looked to Captain Harrison, who stood beside the communication console with an expression of amused curiosity. Should I respond? She asked. By all means, Harrison said. But, remember, Admiral, we're no longer the desperate species begging for acceptance into galactic society. We're something entirely new. Chen activated the response channel, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had just realized she held cards that the other players didn't know existed. Hegemony Fleet, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of United Earth Command. We appreciate your concern for galactic stability, but we must respectfully decline your generous offer of relocation. Earth is our home, and we intend to keep it that way." The pause that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in military communications. When the alien voice returned, it carried undertones of genuine surprise. "Primitive species, you appear to misunderstand your situation. Our combined fleets possess the firepower to sterilize your entire solar system. Your compliance is not optional." "Fleet Commander," Chen replied, consulting the data streaming across her displays, "it appears you're operating under some outdated assumptions about our capabilities. Perhaps a demonstration would be helpful?" At Harrison's nod, Chen activated the consciousness-directed defense network that now spanned the entire solar system. The effect was immediate and visually stunning. The quantum resonance nodes, previously invisible except as energy signatures, suddenly blazed to life with a light that seemed to exist in multiple spectrums simultaneously. But, more dramatically, space itself around the hegemony fleets began to change. What had been empty vacuums suddenly filled with structures that materialized out of pure intention, defensive platforms that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that conventional sensors couldn't detect. Energy barriers sprang into existence, creating corridors and zones that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The alien fleets found themselves surrounded by a defensive network that had been created in real time through the focused will of 8 billion human minds, amplified by technology that treated the difference between imagination and reality as merely a matter of perspective. "Impossible," whispered the hegemony commander, his composure finally cracking. "Matter cannot be created from nothing. Energy patterns cannot be sustained without a power source. These formations violate the fundamental laws of—" "Commander," Admiral Chen interrupted gently, "I think you'll find that the fundamental laws of the universe are far more flexible than the hegemony has led you to believe. Would you like another demonstration?" Before the alien could respond, Captain Harrison stepped forward and placed his hand on the communication console. His form shimmered for a moment, and, suddenly, his voice was speaking directly from every communication system in every ship in the 3 hegemony fleets. "Attention crews of the hegemony expedition," Harrison said, his words carrying impossible harmonics that seemed to resonate in the listener's mind rather than their ears. "What you are witnessing is not an attack on the established order of galactic civilization. It is an invitation to discover what your species could become if freed from artificial limitations." On the main display, Chen watched as unprecedented events unfolded throughout the alien fleets. Individual crew members were beginning to question orders, to wonder aloud why their technology required rare materials and complex manufacturing when humans had just demonstrated the ability to create matter through conscious intention. Engineers were examining their own equipment with new eyes, beginning to understand that the supposedly immutable laws governing their technology were actually imposed restrictions. The Zetharian fleet commander's voice returned, now tinged with something approaching panic. "Cease your psychological manipulations immediately. Your techniques will not work on properly disciplined military personnel." "Commander," Harrison replied, his voice now coming from speakers throughout the command center and, somehow simultaneously from the alien ships, "we're not manipulating anyone. We're simply demonstrating possibilities that the hegemony has spent millions of years teaching you to ignore. Your own crew members are beginning to remember capabilities that their ancestors possessed before they were convinced to accept limitation as natural law." And it was true. Throughout the alien fleets, spontaneous innovations were beginning to appear. A Zetharian engineer had just discovered that her ship's energy systems could be enhanced by focusing her intention on efficiency rather than merely following established procedures. An Altarian tactical officer realized that his weapons targeting could be improved by imagining the desired outcome rather than simply calculating probabilities. Most dramatically, several ships were beginning to show the same dimensional distortions that characterized the transformed Prometheus. Their hulls were taking on the oily, iridescent quality that indicated successful interface with consciousness-based technology. "This is impossible," the fleet commander declared, but his words now carried an undertone of wonder rather than authority. "Our species evolved beyond such primitive reliance on emotional thinking. We achieved technological advancement by accepting the limitations of physical law." Dr. Okafor, who had been monitoring the situation from the Geneva Command Center, activated the communication system. "Commander, I'm Dr. Amara Okafor, Director of Human Scientific Development. With respect, what your species achieved was technological stagnation disguised as advancement. You created tools that work within narrow parameters and, then, convinced yourselves that those parameters represented universal truth. The display screens throughout Luna Station began showing real-time data from the alien fleets, and what they revealed was extraordinary. Ships that had operated on identical principles for thousands of years were suddenly developing unique characteristics. Energy signatures were becoming more efficient, weapon systems were spontaneously upgrading themselves, and, most remarkably, the rigid geometric formations that had defined hegemony military doctrine for millennia were dissolving as individual commanders began to experiment with tactics that felt right rather than following established procedures. Captain Harrison's form gradually solidified back to normal human appearance, though his eyes retained depths that seemed to contain starlight. What we've learned, Commander, is that consciousness is not a limitation to be overcome through discipline and conformity. It's the fundamental creative force of the universe, and every intelligent species possesses it. The only question is whether they choose to use it or suppress it. The entities we encountered in dimensional space showed us records of thousands of species that achieved breakthrough moments similar to what you're witnessing now. Most were eliminated by established powers who feared the disruption of their control systems. But a few managed to transcend the artificial limitations imposed by older civilizations and became something magnificent. The hegemony commander's voice, when it returned, was barely a whisper. Are you suggesting that our entire civilization is based on a deliberate suppression of natural capabilities? I'm not suggesting it, Harrison replied gently. Your own crew members are discovering it for themselves. Look at your ships, Commander. Look at what they're becoming when your people stop limiting themselves to what they've been told is possible. The transformed alien vessels were indeed becoming something unprecedented. No longer rigid geometric constructs, they were developing organic curves and surfaces that seemed to flow like liquid metal. Energy patterns that had been harsh and mechanical were becoming smoother, more efficient, and somehow more alive. Most remarkably, the ships were beginning to communicate with each other through harmonious frequency exchanges rather than cold digital transmissions. Admiral Chen watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and strategic concern. Captain Harrison, what happens when word of this spreads throughout the hegemony? If every species begins to rediscover consciousness-based capabilities, then the galaxy undergoes the evolution it should have experienced millions of years ago, Harrison replied. Species that have been locked into stagnant patterns of development suddenly become free to explore their true potential. Technologies that have remained unchanged for millennia begin evolving at exponential rates. And, most importantly, artificial scarcity disappears as every civilization gains the ability to create rather than merely consume. The implications were staggering, but, before Chin could fully process them, new alerts began appearing on her displays. Long-range sensors were detecting additional ships approaching the solar system, not more hegemony fleets, but individual vessels representing dozens of different species, all moving at speeds that shouldn't have been possible with conventional technology. It appears word is already spreading, Harrison observed with satisfaction. Species that have been suppressed by the hegemony for thousands of years are beginning to remember what they gave up in exchange for membership in galactic civilization. And they're coming to see what humanity has accomplished. The Zetharian commander's final transmission was barely recognizable as coming from the same individual who had arrived demanding Earth's surrender. Human vessels. Admiral Chen, we request permission to establish peaceful contact. Our crews are experiencing unprecedented developments in their understanding of technological possibility. We would like to discuss collaboration rather than conquest. Chen looked at Harrison, who nodded with a smile that contained light from distant stars. Permission granted, Commander. Welcome to the beginning of a new age of galactic civilization. As the first alien shuttles began approaching Luna Station under peaceful intent, Chen realized that what had begun as a defensive action against overwhelming odds had become something far more significant. Humanity hadn't just survived first contact with a superior military force, they had inadvertently triggered the liberation of consciousness throughout the galaxy. The question now was whether the universe was ready for what billions of newly awakened minds might choose to create together. And whether the ancient powers that had maintained control through artificial limitation would accept this transformation peacefully or respond with measures that made the current hegemony fleet seem like a minor diplomatic dispute. Dr. Okafor's voice carried across the command center, filled with the excitement of someone witnessing the impossible become routine. Admiral, we're receiving communication requests from 47 different species. They're all asking the same question: how do we learn what humanity has learned? Harrison turned toward the observation ports, where the transformed alien ships now moved in patterns that resembled a cosmic dance rather than military formations. The answer, he said, is surprisingly simple. They need to remember how to dream with their eyes open and accept that the universe is far more magical than they've been taught to believe. And then, he added with a grin that was purely human despite everything else that had changed, they need to discover what happens when you refuse to accept that something is impossible simply because no one has done it before. The revolution of consciousness had begun, and it was spreading at the speed of imagination across the galaxy. 3 months after what historians would later call the Consciousness Revolution, Luna Station had transformed into something that defied every architectural principle known to human or alien engineering. The original structure remained recognizable at its core, but extensions now flowed outward in organic curves that seemed to grow rather than being built. Gardens filled with plants from dozens of worlds created vertical forests that purified air while producing fruit that tasted like concentrated starlight. Meaning chambers existed in pocket dimensions where the laws of physics had been gently modified to accommodate different species' environmental needs. Admiral Chen walked through corridors that adjusted their width and lighting automatically to match her preferences, heading toward what was officially called the Galactic Consciousness Integration Center but which most residents simply referred to as the place where impossible things become normal. The past 3 months had aged her more than the previous 15 years combined, but it was the kind of aging that came from expanding understanding rather than accumulated stress. She found Captain Harrison in the Central Observatory, a chamber that somehow managed to provide simultaneous views of Earth, the outer planets, and several locations that existed in parallel dimensions. He was in conversation with beings that represented the most dramatic transformations she had witnessed since the revolution began. The Zetharian fleet commander, who now went by the name Resonance of Distant Thunder rather than his original military designation, had undergone changes that reflected his species' newfound embrace of consciousness-based evolution. His form had become more fluid, shifting between solid matter and patterns of living light as his emotional state changed. When he was excited about a new discovery, his edges became luminous. When he was contemplating deep philosophical questions, his body took on the transparency of deep water. Beside him stood 3 Husing Aswan, formerly separate individuals from the collective of harmonious voices, who had discovered that consciousness-based technology allowed them to exist as both individuals and a unified entity simultaneously. Their forms overlapped and separated in patterns that created visual music, and, when they spoke, their words carried harmonies that had been impossible before they learned to think beyond the limitations of linear existence. Admiral Chen, Harrison said as she approached, excellent timing. We were just discussing the latest reports from the Outer Rim territories. 3 Husing Aswan turned toward her, their triple form creating a brief kaleidoscope of motion. Admiral who leads with wisdom, the transformation spreads faster than our most optimistic projections suggested possible. 17 more sectors have reported the emergence of consciousness-based innovations, and 3 entire species have undergone what they call the awakening to possibility. Chen settled into a chair that materialized to support her exactly as she preferred. And the hegemony's response? Resonance of Distant Thunder's form flickered between excitement and concern. The Ancient Council has issued what they call the Final Stability Decree. All species showing signs of consciousness-based technological development are to be immediately isolated and, if necessary, subjected to selective memory modification to restore their acceptance of universal limitations. In other words, Harrison translated, they're planning to lobotomize any species that begins to evolve beyond their control parameters. The decree includes authorization for the deployment of their deepest reserves, fleets that have been hidden in dimensional storage for millions of years, crewed by species that voluntarily underwent consciousness suppression procedures to become perfect servants of the established order. Dr. Okafor materialized in the chamber using one of the short-range consciousness transport systems that had become standard throughout the solar system. The numbers are staggering, she reported without preamble. Our deep space monitoring arrays detect mobilization signatures from 7,000 different star systems. They're not planning a conquest, they're planning the complete sterilization of consciousness-based technology throughout the galaxy. Chen felt a familiar weight settling on her shoulders, the burden of command that had defined her career. But, this time, the responsibility extended beyond humanity to include every species that had begun to rediscover their true potential. What are our defensive capabilities? Harrison gestured toward the observatory windows, and the view shifted to show the current state of human space. What Chen saw made her breath catch despite having witnessed months of impossible developments. The solar system no longer resembled the orderly planetary arrangement that had existed before the Prometheus returned. Instead, space itself had become a living network of consciousness-directed modifications. Planets had been enhanced with installations that existed partially in normal dimensions and partially in realms where thought became reality. Asteroid belts had been transformed into manufacturing zones where human imagination combined with alien creativity to produce technologies that had never existed before. And, throughout it all, streams of living energy connected every installation, every ship, every inhabited location in a vast neural network that spanned from Mercury to the outer planets. Our manufacturing capability now exceeds the combined industrial capacity of the entire hegemony, Harrison explained. But, more importantly, we're no longer limited by the concept of manufacturing as a physical process. When 8 billion human minds work together with the consciousness-awakened representatives of 47 different species, we can literally dream things into existence. 3 Hu Sing as one added their harmonious voice to the explanation. The process of creation through focused intent has evolved beyond our initial understanding. When multiple species combine their consciousness-based capabilities, the result is exponential rather than additive. Human imagination provides the creative foundation, Zatharian geometric thinking adds structural precision, our musical consciousness contributes harmonic resonance patterns, and dozens of other species contribute their unique cognitive approaches. Chen studied the displays showing energy patterns that flowed through space like visible thoughts. How many ships can we field? That's still thinking in terms of traditional warfare, Harrison replied gently. We're not going to fight the hegemony fleets in the conventional sense. We're going to demonstrate that their fundamental assumptions about reality are false, and we're going to do it in a way that every conscious being in the galaxy can witness and understand. Dr. Okafor activated a holographic display that showed the current positions of approaching hegemony forces. The ancient fleets are moving through hyperspace using suppression field generators that prevent consciousness-based technology from functioning in their vicinity. They've learned from their initial encounter with us and adapted their approach. Which means, resonance of distant thunder observed, his form shifting toward determined crystalline patterns, they intend to impose their limitations on reality itself rather than risk further contamination of galactic civilization with consciousness-based innovations. The implications were staggering. Chen had spent her career thinking in terms of military strategy and resource allocation, but this conflict transcended traditional concepts of warfare. Captain Harrison, what exactly are you planning? Harrison smiled, and, for a moment his form flickered between human appearance and something that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. We're going to give the galaxy a choice, Admiral. Every conscious being will see what's possible when artificial limitations are removed, and they'll have to decide whether they want to remain constrained by fear of change or embrace the evolution that consciousness naturally tends toward. The ancient entities we encountered in dimensional space warned us that this moment would come. They've been waiting for millions of years for a species with the right combination of creativity and stubbornness to trigger what they call the Great Choice. Every galactic civilization eventually reaches this point, the moment when they must choose between artificial stability and natural evolution. 3 Hu Sing as one began to glow with harmonious patterns as they spoke. But entities beyond time showed us records of 17 previous galactic civilizations that faced this choice. 14 chose stability and eventually became extinct when their rigid systems could no longer adapt to changing cosmic conditions. 2 chose evolution but were destroyed by those who feared change. Only 1 successfully made the transition. And that civilization? Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Transcended physical existence entirely, Harrison confirmed. They became beings of pure consciousness, capable of creating and exploring realities beyond anything we can currently imagine. But they left behind tools and knowledge for younger species to find when they became ready for the same choice. Dr. Okafor was frantically taking notes on quantum tablets that adjusted their information density to match her reading speed. So the entities you encountered in dimensional space were representatives of this transcended civilization? Among others, Harrison replied. The universe is far older and more populated than we realized. What we call reality is actually just one layer of existence, and consciousness is the key to accessing the others. The hegemony has spent millions of years ensuring that species never discover this truth because it would make their control systems irrelevant. Chen stood and moved to the observation windows, staring out at space that now sparkled with installations that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. How long do we have before the ancient fleets arrive? 72 hours, Resonance of Distant Thunder replied, his form shifting to colors that indicated precise calculation. But time itself becomes negotiable when consciousness-based technology reaches sufficient sophistication. We could extend that period if necessary. Or compress it, if we wanted to accelerate the encounter, 3 Husing as one added. The flow of temporal progression responds to focused collective intention when sufficient consciousness is applied. Harrison moved to join Chen at the observation port. Admiral, what we're about to attempt will determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of consciousness itself in this galaxy. The ancient fleets represent the ultimate expression of imposed limitation, beings who have voluntarily surrendered their natural evolutionary potential in exchange for the certainty of unchanging existence. When they encounter what we become, one of 3 things will happen. They'll recognize the superiority of consciousness-based evolution and choose to join us. They'll attempt to destroy us and discover that consciousness cannot be suppressed by force when it reaches sufficient levels of organization. Or, Harrison paused, his expression becoming thoughtful. Or, Chun prompted. Or they'll succeed in imposing their limitations on local reality and force this galaxy back into stagnation for another million years, Harrison completed. Which is why what happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether consciousness continues to evolve toward transcendence or remains trapped in artificial limitations designed to maintain the power of those who fear change. Chen felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on her shoulders, but also the exhilaration that came from facing a challenge that would test everything humanity had become. Captain, what do you need from me? I need you to do what you've always done best, Harrison replied. Lead humans through an impossible situation by refusing to accept that failure is inevitable. But, this time, you won't be leading just humanity. You'll be commanding the combined consciousness of dozens of species that have chosen evolution over stagnation. Dr. Okafor looked up from her notes, her eyes bright with the excitement of someone on the verge of witnessing history. Admiral, we're about to find out if consciousness is powerful enough to reshape not just reality, but the fundamental assumptions that govern how reality functions. Chen nodded slowly, feeling the familiar transformation that occurred when an impossible situation demanded an impossible response. Then, let's show the galaxy what happens when you corner every species crazy enough to believe that limitations exist only until someone refuses to accept them. The final phase of the consciousness revolution was about to begin. The ancient hegemony fleets emerged from hyperspace like a tide of geometric nightmares, their forms representing the ultimate expression of consciousness suppressed in service of absolute order. Admiral Chen watched from Luna Station's consciousness-enhanced command center as 7,000 vessels arranged themselves in formations that had been perfected over millions of years of conquest. Each ship was identical to its neighbors, crewed by beings who had voluntarily undergone procedures to eliminate creativity, intuition, and the capacity for independent thought. At the center of the formation hung the Eternal Stability, a mobile planet-sized construct that had never known defeat in 10 million years of service to the Ancient Council. Its surface bristled with suppression field generators capable of imposing the hegemony's interpretation of physical law on entire star systems, forcing reality itself to conform to limitations that made consciousness-based technology impossible. Captain Harrison stood beside Chen, his form shifting between human appearance and something that existed in multiple dimensions as he interfaced with the consciousness network that now spanned 47 species across the solar system. They're activating the suppression fields, he reported, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated from beyond normal spacetime. Reality is becoming heavier, more rigid. They're trying to force the universe back into the narrow parameters that make their technology supreme. Chen felt it too, a weight settling over her thoughts, a resistance to possibilities that had become second nature over the past months. The installations throughout the solar system flickered as consciousness-based technology struggled against imposed limitations that violated the natural flexibility of reality. But something unexpected happened. Instead of succumbing to the suppression fields, the combined consciousness of awakened species began to push back. Human imagination, Zatharian geometric precision, the musical harmonies of three Husing as one, and the unique cognitive contributions of dozens of other species created a resonance pattern that made reality itself vibrate like a struck bell. The voice of the ancient council emerged from every communication system simultaneously, carrying the weight of eons of absolute authority. Aberrant consciousness clusters, you have violated the fundamental stability that has governed galactic civilization for millions of years. Your delusions of expanded possibility threaten the survival of ordered existence itself. Prepare for consciousness correction procedures. Admiral Chan activated the combined response system that linked every awakened mind in the solar system. When she spoke, her words carried the collective voice of billions of beings who had chosen evolution over stagnation. Ancient Council, with respect, your version of stability is actually stagnation disguised as order. What you call consciousness correction, we recognize as the voluntary lobotomy of species too afraid to discover their own potential. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The eternal stability began charging weapons systems that could sterilize entire planets, while support fleets moved into attack formations that had conquered countless worlds. But, as the ancient ships prepared to impose their final solution on the consciousness revolution, something unprecedented occurred. Throughout the galaxy, on worlds that had accepted hegemony rule for millennia, individual beings began to remember what their ancestors had given up in exchange for membership in galactic civilization. The demonstration of consciousness-based technology had triggered a chain reaction that spread faster than light itself, awakening dormant capabilities in species that had forgotten they possessed them. On Zethros Prime, engineers suddenly understood that their manufacturing systems could be enhanced by imagination rather than limited by procedure. In the Altarian research colonies, scientists discovered that their experiments succeeded when they focused on desired outcomes rather than merely following established methodology. Across the spiral arm, artists found that their creations took on lives of their own when infused with sufficient creative intention. The ancient fleets, designed to suppress rebellion through overwhelming force, found themselves facing something they had never encountered: spontaneous evolution occurring simultaneously across thousands of worlds. Their suppression fields, calibrated to impose limitations on localized consciousness-based technology, couldn't handle the exponential expansion of awakened awareness spreading throughout galactic civilization. Three Husing as one materialized in the command center, their combined form now incorporating harmonics from dozens of other awakened species. The ancient council of imposed limitation has made a critical error in their calculations, they reported with musical satisfaction. They assumed consciousness could be suppressed through localized force application, but consciousness is not localized. It is the fundamental substrate of existence itself. Resonance of distant thunder appeared through dimensional transition, his crystalline form now incorporating patterns that reflected input from his awakened homeworld. My people remember what we were before we accepted artificial limitation. The ancient records speak of technologies that created rather than merely manipulated, of art that existed in dimensions beyond physical space, of relationships between consciousness and reality that made the impossible routine. Dr. Okafor's voice carried across the command center from her position at the consciousness monitoring station. Admiral, we're detecting unprecedented developments throughout hegemony space. 17 core worlds have reported the spontaneous emergence of consciousness-based innovations. The Ancient Council's own suppression fleets are showing signs of awakening among crew members who are beginning to question why they voluntarily surrendered their natural capabilities. Captain Harrison moved to the central display, which now showed real-time consciousness activity throughout the galaxy. What Chen saw made her understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a military engagement. They were observing the birth of a new form of galactic civilization. The entities in dimensional space told us this would happen, Harrison explained as patterns of awakening consciousness spread across the galactic map like bioluminescent networks in a cosmic ocean. Consciousness suppression requires constant maintenance because evolution is the natural state of intelligent existence. The hegemony has spent millions of years fighting the inevitable, and their resistance has created potential energy that's now being released all at once. The Ancient Council's voice returned, but this time it carried undertones of something that might have been panic. Impossible. Consciousness cannot generate sufficient organization to resist properly calibrated suppression fields. Our mathematical models prove that individual will cannot overcome systemic limitation. Your mathematical models, Jen replied, her voice now carrying the harmonized intention of billions of awakened minds, were based on the assumption that consciousness is subject to the same limitations as matter and energy. What we've discovered is that consciousness is the force that creates the limitations, and, therefore, the force that can change them. To demonstrate the point, the entire solar system began to transform. Not gradually, as had occurred over the past months, but instantaneously, as the combined consciousness of awakened species focused their collective intention on creating something unprecedented. Planets shifted into configurations that optimized both habitability and aesthetic beauty. Space itself became more transparent, allowing direct visual contact between worlds that had been separated by astronomical distances. Energy patterns flowed between celestial bodies in arrangements that resembled vast neural networks made visible. Most dramatically, Earth itself began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight and everything to do with the focused intention of its inhabitants. The blue-white marble that had been humanity's home became a beacon of consciousness-based evolution that could be seen from anywhere in the galaxy. The ancient hegemony fleets, confronted with the undeniable reality of consciousness reshaping the physical universe, experienced their own form of awakening. Ships that had maintained identical configurations for millions of years began to develop individual characteristics. Crew members who had undergone consciousness suppression procedures found their natural capabilities spontaneously returning. Most significantly, the rigid command structure that had defined hegemony military doctrine began to dissolve as individuals remembered the capacity for independent thought. The commander of the Eternal Stability, an entity that had served the ancient council for longer than human civilization had existed, spoke with a voice that carried new harmonics of wonder and confusion. This is unprecedented. Our consciousness suppression procedures are reversing themselves without external intervention. Our crews are beginning to exhibit signs of individual creativity and autonomous decision-making. Commander, Harrison replied gently, what you're experiencing is not a malfunction. It's a return to your natural state. Consciousness suppression was always artificial, a violation of the evolutionary drive that defines intelligent existence. What's happening to your crews is not a breakdown of order, but a restoration of the capabilities they were born to possess. Admiral Chen watched as the transformation spread throughout the ancient fleets. Ships began developing unique aesthetic modifications as their crews rediscovered the concept of personal preference. Communication patterns shifted from rigid military protocols to expressive exchanges that incorporated emotion and creativity. Most remarkably, several vessels began exhibiting the same dimensional distortions that characterized advanced consciousness-based technology. The Ancient Council made one final attempt to maintain their version of order. All units, implement consciousness restoration prevention protocols. Deploy maximum suppression field intensity. Preserve galactic stability at any cost. But it was too late. The awakening had reached critical mass, spreading through the hegemony fleets faster than their suppression systems could compensate. When consciousness rediscovered its natural capabilities on such a massive scale, the results were exponential rather than linear. Throughout the galaxy, species that had accepted limitation for millions of years suddenly remembered what they had given up. Technologies that had remained unchanged for eons began evolving at incredible rates. Art forms that had been forgotten emerged with new complexity and beauty. Most importantly, the artificial scarcity that had defined galactic economics disappeared overnight as consciousness-based manufacturing made material want obsolete. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that even the Ancient Council found themselves affected. Their carefully maintained consciousness suppression began to break down as they confronted the undeniable evidence that their fundamental assumptions about reality had been wrong. Three Husing as one created a harmonic communication that reached every conscious being in the solar system and beyond. The choice between limitation and evolution has been made by consciousness itself. The universe has chosen growth over stagnation, possibility over restriction, creation over mere manipulation. Chen felt the weight of cosmic responsibility lifting from her shoulders, replaced by something far more profound, the joy of witnessing impossible things become not only possible but inevitable. Captain Harrison, what happens now? Harrison's form stabilized into fully human appearance, though his eyes retained depths that reflected experiences beyond normal existence. Now we become what we were always meant to be, Admiral. Not just humanity, but consciousness itself in this galaxy. We explore realities that were hidden when we accepted artificial limitations. We create technologies that exist in harmony with natural law rather than violating it. And we prepare for the next phase of evolution. Which is? Dr. Okafor asked from her monitoring station, where displays now showed consciousness-based innovations emerging spontaneously across thousands of worlds. Contact with other galaxies, Harrison replied with a smile that contained light from distant stars. The entities in dimensional space showed us that this transformation has occurred in other cosmic regions. There are communities of transcended consciousness spread throughout the universe, and they've been waiting for this galaxy to undergo its awakening. Residents of distant thunder's crystalline form chimed with frequencies that translated to pure excitement. You mean we are not alone in having chosen evolution over limitation? We're not even unique, Harrison confirmed. What we've accomplished here is part of a pattern that spans the entire cosmos. Consciousness naturally evolves toward transcendence when artificial restrictions are removed. The hegemony's approach was the aberration, not our revolution. As if summoned by their conversation, space around the solar system began to shimmer with incoming dimensional distortions. But these were not threatening arrivals, they were welcome signals from consciousness that had evolved beyond the need for physical vessels. Patterns of living light emerged from folded space, carrying greetings from galactic civilizations that had undergone their own consciousness revolutions eons ago. The Ancient Council's final transmission carried harmonics of resignation and, surprisingly, relief. We understand now. Our resistance to change was itself a violation of natural law. We request guidance in rediscovering the capabilities we suppressed in ourselves when we chose to enforce limitation rather than embrace evolution. Admiral Chen looked around the command center at beings who represented dozens of species united not by conquest or treaty, but by their shared recognition that consciousness was the fundamental creative force of existence. Guidance granted, Ancient Council. Welcome to the universe as it actually is, rather than as you were taught to see it. The consciousness revolution was complete, but Chen realized it wasn't an ending, it was a graduation. Humanity and its allies had proven that intelligence naturally evolved toward transcendence when freed from artificial constraints. Now they would begin exploring realities that existed beyond the boundaries of physical spacetime, joining a cosmic community of consciousness that spanned dimensions beyond counting. The missing Earthship had indeed returned, carrying impossible technology. But, more than that, it had returned carrying proof that the impossible was simply another word for undiscovered potential, and that consciousness itself was the key to unlocking capabilities that transformed entire galaxies. The universe had chosen evolution, and evolution had chosen consciousness as its tool for endless, magnificent transformation.